Good morning. Today is March 21st, and I'm sure most of us are glued to the television watching the disaster unfolding in Ukraine on a day-by-day basis, and I think it's not going to get better very soon. But I thought I would step back a little bit and talk mostly this morning about the various aspects of what's happening in the Ukraine to world affairs in general, the collateral events that have taken place, some of which have gotten some attention and some of which haven't gotten attention, because quite obviously it's not just a question of the disaster in Ukraine and the Russian policy, but it's also that many things in the world will never be the same, that many have observed that the end of the 30-year Cold War has come, and now we're in a new era. Of course, it's very difficult as a new era unfolds to be accurate in describing it, but it's worth starting to describe what has been going on and how it's affected world affairs. Political affairs, economic affairs, social affairs, climatological affairs, and so on. So let me step back pre the Ukraine invasion. You may recall that for a decade or so, all we've been talking about is globalization and the interlinking of the world. And during that period, the right, the populist right and the populist left, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, reared their heads and opposed the idea of globalization. What were manifestations of that? UK leaving the European Union, Brexit, Trump railing against US involvement in the world, we'll never get involved again, and we're going to leave NATO and all of that. So there was a reaction against the globalization, as I said, particularly on the political left and political right in the United States and in other countries. Then came COVID, and COVID allowed every one of us to see to the extent to which globalization was well and alive, but under the circumstances of COVID and reactions against COVID, problems arose. So that while on the one hand, Trump said, we need to rely on ourselves and not other countries, even President Biden sort of said, we need to manufacture more things at home. And all of us are still, in a sense, the victims of the inability of countries to manage on their own in the areas of technology, whether it's chips, whether it's cars parts, whether it's television parts, computer parts, whether it's any number of things that we're used to having, which are difficult to obtain because of a combination of forces. That is to say, on the one hand, the COVID and all the disruptions that COVID had caused. And on the other hand, various countries pulling in and saying, we're going to service our own population before we ship anything overseas. And then, as we know, all the shipping has been held over. So at this particular point now, as we speak, it's not just that people have railed against globalization, but the malfunctions of globalization have become apparent, not quite in the way that the right and the left, extreme right and left suggested, namely we're losing our, national identity and things of that sort, but also in terms of commerce, right? And so then, on top of everything else, we now have the Ukrainian situation. And the Ukrainian situation has had two effects in this era, in this sense of interstate relations. One, helping globalization, and the other, in a sense, harming globalization. The helping globalization, at least on a regional basis, may not quite be global in that sense, has been that countries and organizations that were falling apart, the institutions were at risk, have in effect picked up and are now vital and really important. What is one talking about? NATO, right? US was going to get out of NATO. What NATO was supposed to be doing wasn't quite clear anymore. All of a sudden, NATO is at the forefront of the West in organizing military affairs and potentially having to get involved down the road, we don't know yet, but a very important security mechanism for the Western democratic, some not so democratic, Turkey is part of NATO, countries in terms of manpower, in terms of arms, in terms of capacity, and having a mission, right? So NATO has been revived in a sense that it didn't look that way 2-3 years ago. The other thing that has been revived to some extent has been the European Union, which was operational but was having all kinds of difficulties, in part for things we've talked about before, that you had authoritarian regimes like Hungary, like Poland, seemingly not measuring up to the standards in human rights and political affairs that are demanded by the European Union and the various laws and courts, human rights courts, and so forth in Europe. So there were aspects of the European Union which were also sort of, if not exactly disintegrating, at least under tension, and therefore the future role of the European Union, if it could keep all the countries together, was in question. Now Ukraine happens, and the European Union has gotten a new life. Indeed, the new life includes Hungary and Poland, which are places which, if you recall, did not want to take refugees, for example, from Afghanistan, and therefore were violating the norms of the European other countries, and they were criticized, and now they are the recipients of millions, actually hundreds of thousands in the case of Hungary and millions in the case of Poland. So that while Poland and Hungary may still come under the microscope down the road for its absence of some democratic values valued by all the other members of the European Union, for the time being, all the members, including Poland and Hungary, are now operating pretty much in unison, and the various conflicts and quarrels and so forth have been set aside. Indeed, even countries which did not want to join NATO, for example, Finland and Sweden are now talking about maybe joining NATO. While you may say, well, the European Union does not involve, let's say, doesn't directly involve the United States. NATO, of course, does, including Canada. So one of the effects of in a sense, the seeming weakening of the forces, at least of regional, and in the case of NATO, not entirely regional, but institutions, which are part of the globalization aspect, and were under risk or were weakening and were straying, have now all of a sudden been strengthened and come to the fore. So where are we in terms of all this globalization business? I get to the economics in a minute. The world is pretty integrated, and we know it's pretty integrated because of the havoc it's playing in the global economy in various states and parts and bits and pieces that are manufactured, not just in technology, but even our clothing. Go to Costco, almost everything is manufactured overseas. And every country is saying, well, we're now going to revert back to a kind of country with a shell around it, which does some trade, but certainly is not integrated into an economic system, is a high overreaction and is not really a reality. And where we stand with all of this down the road, a year or two from now, is not clear. But what I want to show you is there's been a trajectory on the one hand, globalization accepted by everybody, certainly economic globalization. And then all of a sudden, Russia invades Ukraine, and you have all the consequences of that. And people are saying, well, yes, we need some autonomy. We need to worry about things. But there also is a role for the integration of countries and their politics and their economics. I'll get to the economics in a moment, but just let me quickly say that one of the members of the European Union and also of NATO has been Germany, whose whole history since the end of the Cold War has been to take a pacifist stance. That is to say, yes, they have some military forces. Indeed, some of them were even in Afghanistan. But on the other hand, they have played down any kind of military role, and have been sort of absent in many ways, except of course that Angela Merkel, when she was head of the German government, allowed lots and lots of refugees in as a kind of way of saying Germany has learned its lesson and it has obligations on the humanitarian side. Germany, by the way, is also admitting lots of refugees nowadays again. In any event, Germans' pacifism at the beginning, when Russia started attacking Ukraine, was still intact, and they refused to send any arms and only sent helmets. That became sort of a joke. The Germans are sending helmets while the Russians, are sending battalions and whatnot. Germany has changed its tune. So Germany is now fully aboard, participating in NATO, shipping arms to the Ukraine. And so Germany's role, in a sense, in Europe, and potentially maybe even in world affairs, has changed to this Ukraine affair. Now, turning to economics for a moment, as I said, the sort of fraying of the economic interdependence started long before the end of, before the Ukraine disaster started. But, and as I said, heads of state, Trump, Biden, German, Macron, and France, and so forth, were arguing, we need to have more control of the economy. A lot of that was rhetoric. Some of it, I suppose, were intentions. We don't have to import T-shirts from Vietnam and Indonesia. We can make them on our own. We can be slightly more autonomous. But very quickly, it became obvious that much of this might be wishful thinking and rhetoric, because in point of fact, as we speak in 2022, the integration of world economies is still alive and well, and the extent to which the Chinese economy can become slightly more autonomous as the U.S. economy and so forth isn't totally clear. There are signs of some pulling in of the global aspects and outreach of the economy. Now, that leads one to not want to belabor that point, which is fairly clear, but then quickly turn to the business of energy. Because one of the things, of course, the world is very interdependent on is energy. 40% of, or 23% or 33%, depending on what countries in Europe, were dependent on Russian and oil and gas. And, the uncertainty of all of that, and wanting to argue that no energy ought to be imported because of the Ukraine, is in some senses easier said than done in the middle of a winter for some countries in Europe. But it's also very quickly led to something else, which those of us who are interested in climate change might be interested in, which leads everybody to say we need to wean ourselves off the importation of oil and gas. And how do we do that? Well, obviously, we do it with emphasis on renewable energy, right? And so like the Scandinavian countries and Denmark and so forth, which are doing much in terms of wind energy and so forth. There are, of course, countries like Germany and France, which have, and England, United Kingdom, which have a harder time doing it. They're very much dependent on the importation of oil and energy sources from Russia. So what is happening there? Well, what is happening there, of course, is that a very quick move into saying we've got to do more about going green, which is an altogether good thing, right? And on the other hand, countries like Germany, which after the nuclear incident in Japan decided that they were going to get rid of nuclear energy, and wanted to close their nuclear plants, are now thinking again by looking at France and saying, actually, France is getting a far amount of its electricity from its nuclear plants. And maybe we need to move more into nuclearization ourselves for energy. That's sort of interesting because it means that countries recognize that going green per se is not that easy and is a long process, especially depending on where your country is located and its climate and all the rest. But it's also saying in the interim, we better find sources other than oil and gas. And it's a new development, and it's a development which, oddly speaking, even the political Greens in countries, for example, Germany has a coalition government. One of the coalition partners is a Green Party, and they are in favor of expanding nuclear energy. So, which they were totally against some years ago. So there's been a kind of a climate reckoning, given the dependence on the energy sources. Now you may say, well, we go to gas pump and it's still all very expensive. That's absolutely true. Making these changes and adjustments will take some time, but I want to urge you to see that people are now looking, governments and their citizens are looking differently about how you think about energy sources. In many cases, not thinking about the environment and climate change in the first instance, but in the second instance, that would have a positive impact on climate issues. So that's an interesting spin-off. That's an interesting collateral rethinking that has happened since the Ukraine disastrous affairs have taken place. Now, the other economic aspect, which is very, very serious and has gotten some attention, the New York Times finally wrote a front page article on it, has to do with food. Because part of globalization was that food moved from one country to another, and that you've probably heard that both the Ukraine and Russia were considered the sort of food baskets for much of the grains that people depended on around the world. And first of all, these shipments are not leaving and going to those places. And second of all, the war in the Ukraine also means that planting season will be missed and there will be even fewer grains to go around. Now, this doesn't seem like a problem sitting in Santa Cruz for the moment, other than the fact that grain prices are going up and we're paying more and more for bread and other things. But it is a potential famine disaster, not just a minor disaster, major disaster for many countries. Countries as far afield as Egypt, some African countries, are reliant on grains from either the Ukraine or a combination of Ukraine and Russia for 30 to 40% of their grains. Okay, and in poor countries, much of what people eat comes from grains. And since the 1950s, late 1950s, early 1960s, maybe, when people didn't have enough food, it was due to their poverty and or conflict in their societies. It wasn't that there wasn't enough food to go around in the world. And we are fast approaching a situation which goes back to the days where countries will have famine based on the inability of getting access to food because there isn't enough. And this is a startling spin-off of this conflict, that the sort of breadbasket of for many countries is in the country Ukraine, to some extent Russia, that are now in conflict. It is going to be a disaster. Now, it is still true, of course, that people are starving in various parts of the world, for example, Afghanistan. And that, that has to do with the conflict and how that conflict came to an end. And if we had the mental space and the TV and so forth had the space to tell us what's going on in Afghanistan around, it is a human disaster. Children are dying right and left, right? It is horrendous. But what I'm saying is that aside from those kinds of things, and countries which are very poor anyway, we are very quickly reaching a point where there will be a global food shortage. So people in rich countries will still be able to pay enough to get a handle on whatever their needs are, may have some alternatives. But it is a downward escalator, and it is very serious, and it hasn't gotten enough attention. Even in the US, there's an issue. Farmers in the US are impacted by climate change, but they are now also impacted by the cost of energy, which means that they are not planting as much and they can't harvest as much. And so American export of grains will also be reduced. So it isn't somebody else's problem out there. It is a global problem. And part of the globalization of shipping food around and growing it where it is advantageous to grow it and then shipping it around is being badly affected by this Ukraine situation. It is very serious. It is going to be increasingly serious, and we need to keep our eye on it. Then, I'm talking about politics and economics. So let's look at the human dimension. 10 million Ukrainians at this point have had to leave their homes, of which 4 million, roughly speaking, probably going on 5 in the next week or two, have had to leave their country, right? The rest are inside their countries as refugees from whatever city or part of Ukraine they live in. It is a huge refugee population. There are people who are without any means. They are heavily women and children at this point. Some of their husbands will be killed. Countries have stepped up in this instance in a way that has not been seen since after World War, well, during, in part, before, during, and after World War II. Many of the people, as you know, are going to East Bloc, what used to be East Bloc countries, proximate to the Ukraine. Poland in particular, I think they have over 2 million refugees right now. Hungary, Romania, and many folks are trying to go beyond. They're trying to get to the United States or Canada if they have relatives, or to England, or to Western Europe, and so forth. So many countries will have huge Ukrainian refugee populations. Can these people ever go back? Some perhaps down the road. Many will never go back. So it means incorporation of refugees, providing shelter, providing schooling. You might have seen the admirable stories that in Poland, many schools are actually absorbing some of the Ukrainian children, who of course don't speak Polish. And so sending them to school and so forth. So people really are stepping up. There is a kind of an international dimension of countries looking onto all of this in Asia, in Africa, in the Caribbean, and saying, why is it that the Ukrainian refugees are being looked after, cared for, and absorbed when our refugees were not? I mean, why is it so hard for Afghanistani refugees to get into the US or to get into Europe? some of the very countries which are generous right now, for example, again, Poland and Hungary, wouldn't allow any of the Afghanistan or Syrian refugees in. They just simply wouldn't. It was Germany and some other countries that were more hospitable. Why is it that the victims of civil wars in the Sudan and in Ethiopia now and so forth are not welcome? Why is it that under the disastrous situation in Haiti, we let people sink in the waters and we're not allowing them in? And of course, the charge is, well, it's racism, right? Well, it's racism, it's hostility to brown and black people, it is hostility to people of, in the case of Muslims, to other religions, but it is fairly unsightly. And I think in our sort of souls and our dispositions to our political leaders, we need to examine a situation where so many people find it so difficult to stay wherever they are. And at the same time, when they feel they must leave, when their lives are at risk, as they are in the Ukraine, as they are in Afghanistan, as they are in other places, we're saying, no, 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 not so fast. You know, Aleppo was bombed to smithereens, but Syrian refugees, just like the cities now in Ukraine, by the Russians, by the way, and we wouldn't, many countries in Europe, the United States and so forth, wouldn't let Syrian refugees come in. So there is a kind of moral, ethical question here as to, on the one hand, people are spreading out all over the world that are refugees. What can we do to make it possible for people to stay in their own countries, especially when the countries are not at war, but just need major kinds of economic and social help? It is an issue for the future. It's also an issue for now. But it is, as I said, a moral and ethical issue. And while I think we all are delighted that there is as much hospitality to the refugees from the Ukraine, we also in our hearts need to examine why it is that we are willing to say, all right, so they're Europeans and they look like us, and therefore we'll look after them. But these other people, they're too different. We don't want them. I have talked about before how even if you decide that you will reduce the global interdependence in some economic realms, the fact that people are going to move around from country to country because populations age, labor is needed, political circumstance, social circumstance, is not entirely new. It's not a new issue, and I've talked about it before. But what is new is that the Ukrainian situation re-raises that question practically, philosophically, and morally. And so part of the collateral aspects of the Ukraine situation, which we even if the Ukraine situation were resolved, are economic, political, social, humanitarian, and they will not go away even if the Ukraine gets itself sorted out and is not completely flattened by the Russians, and if we can avoid nuclear war and so forth and so on. And those are long-term issues. Those are not issues that are particular to the Ukraine. And I think it's worthwhile for us to keep an eye on all of these other issues, the collateral issues, because they will dictate the next decade or two in our individual and collective lives, not just the Ukraine situation. Thank you very much for listening, and see you in 2 weeks.